Hey guys, well, I'm coming to you today from my office, so we'll see if it maybe changes up the scenery a little bit for you, and a little different view than the chair than my bathroom. So I'm see if this is working on my YouTube channel. I am excited about teaching this and looking forward to our study here of Matthew chapter 24. Hope that you were able to watch the first lesson. I intended on doing it yesterday and had some things come up and didn't get to do it, so I'm doing it here on Wednesday. And we'll be studying about the signs as often purported of the end of time by Jesus here in Matthew 24, and looking at how I believe those should be taken as referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. And so we're going to be looking at that, thinking about that in just a moment. So turning your Bibles to Matthew 24. This is a difficult passage, and we want to examine to seek to understand the passage within its context. Matthew 23, Jesus has just spoken to the Pharisees and scribes, and he ends that by lamenting over Jerusalem. And then he is walking by the temple area. Just left that in verse 1. He going away when his disciples came to the point out to him the buildings of the temple. So it's in the context of them going by the temple and talking about those things and dealing with that Jesus is asked a question or two questions by his apostles, causes him to answer some things. And then, of course, the latter context is him talking about the second coming, his own return, and down through chapter 25, which we just studied in the last lesson. Now, I want to make sure this video is working, because there's nothing worse than talking 45 minutes to yourself and it not be recording. All right, here we are. We're live now, so that's good. I want to make sure it was recording. Yes. Let me minimize that. All right, so let's continue on. So Matthew 24, we always want to use the literal, straightforward passages to try to interpret the more difficult passages. There's a few things here that I don't know about this passage. It can be a difficult passage to understand, but I think there's some things that I can share with you that will help us, and that there's a lot of powerful lessons here we can learn also from this passage. So let's begin in verse 3, Matthew 24, verse 3. So they're walking by the temple, and remember, this is a great temple that was still ongoing, being built at the time of Jesus, Herod's temple. And they pointed out these buildings in verse 2. You see all these, do you not? Jesus answered them. He says, truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. So he says there's going to be a time, real soon it seems, the idea that every stone here will be thrown down. There's going to be a tremendous event. Now, if you think about that, that would be like you walking through Manila with some friends, and one of the key, most important buildings in Manila, I'm not sure what that building is, but one of the government buildings or one of the historic buildings, a building that is huge and significant, and someone says, hey, look at that building, isn't that a beautiful building? And you said, I tell you, there's going to be a time when one stone's not going to be left upon another. That entire building's going to be destroyed. And that would raise some eyebrows, wouldn't it? I mean, your friends who were walking with you would think, what's he talking about? Why would he say that? Now, this is, of course, if you were saying that, they would say, what gives you the knowledge, the special insight? But when Jesus says it, he's a prophet. He could know the future. And so when he says it, the disciples were really curious about this. And so they asked the question in verse number 3. He sat on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came to him privately, saying. So that after a little while goes by, they sit down, and they say to him, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the close of the age?" When will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the close of the age? Now, we need to think about the questions here. Was it one question or two questions? Was it one or two questions? Well, in the mind of the apostles, it might have simply been one question. They may not have thought about the possibility that if all these things were destroyed, that there could actually be life after that. They might have been thinking that if this entire temple is destroyed, not one stone left another, that is the end. And so they ask this question. They say, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the close of the age? So he's been talking about his coming, as we've been studying. He frequently talked about that. And now he says, they say to him, when will these things be? That's the first question. When will these things be? When is this temple going to be destroyed? And when or what are the signs of your coming and the close of the age? Now, the close of the age brings up an interesting question. Is the close of the age the end of the Mosaical age, the end of that time, the end of the temple age? It seems that they're most likely referring to the final end of time. Now, looking at the answers that Jesus is going to give helps us know for sure how Jesus understood the questions. And what I think it is helpful to see is that Jesus addresses two questions. Irrespective of how the apostles asked the question, Jesus is going to answer two questions. He answers, first of all, when will these things be, and what are the signs of that? What are the signs of that, and when will these things be? And secondly, what and when is he going to come at the end of the age? All right. Now, the problem with this, and you have to kind of, sometimes we want to draw just hard and fast lines, but there cannot, sometimes you have to understand that these can be intermingled a little bit. That Christ can be referring to one, but the first, as we talked about with the prophet Joel, and how he was foreshadowing in the day of the Lord, in the enemy armies destroying Israel and Judah, how that was a foreshadowing of the ultimate day of the Lord at the end of time. And there's that dual kind of meaning in it. Well, it seems that there's the same idea a little bit here, in that you have this idea, and theologians have different names for this, but trying to speak about it as simply as possible. It's a foreshadowing. It's often a dualistic, I call it, where the same idea is being used to refer to both. And it seems here that some of our thoughts are going to have some overlap. All right? Some overlap. And that Christ is going, and what I mean by that overlap is, Christ is seen just as he was in Joel, and just as we see in other passages that we can note, especially in the book of Revelation, but also he refers to this during his trial and imprisonment and things like that, and his before his crucifixion. When you have this idea of the Son of Man coming on the clouds, and the idea that the coming of Jesus, the coming of God, the working of God is not always a reference to the end of time, but sometimes God Christ is pictured as coming, bringing a judgment, bringing a decisive decision within history upon a people or group. Now, this is common in the Old Testament, and we've noticed and seen some of that in our other studies on eschatology. And I think we see it here, that Christ is talking about two comings. He's talking about his first coming through the agency of the Roman army. And that's going to be common in the book of Revelation. He talks about his coming in destruction upon Rome, in his punishment of Rome, who are punishing the Christians at that time. He's coming in judgment. He's bringing his wrath. He's bringing his decision down upon them. But it is within time. It's not an end of time coming, but it is a within time judgment. While this is also going to refer later on to the final end of time judgment. All right? So, we're dealing with two primary questions. When will these things be? When will the temple be destroyed? And what will be the sign of your coming in the end of the age? What will be the sign of your coming? Now, I want you to then notice in your Bible, so that's the questions, and then Jesus answered them. See that no one leads you astray, verse 4. So you don't want to be led astray, them to be led astray, and he begins to tell them a lot of things, and I can read that in just a moment. But before we go read that, I want us to skip down to verse 34. Skip down to verse 34. Now, we'll get the overall context more in a moment, but right now, I want you to get the idea that of what is pictured here in verse 34. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. For heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. I call this verse the continental divide of verse 30 of chapter 24. And I think it's a very significant verse for interpreting this passage. Now, it's still doesn't clear up every difficulty, but I think it helps us go a long ways in understanding the passage. Are you familiar with the term continental divide? A continental divide is something we have here in America and in our continent. And the idea is that on the continent, on the U.S., there is one area, it's out kind of west, and we through the Rocky Mountains and things, that when rain falls on that area, that it is the dividing point, it's the high point, if you will, where if rain falls on the west side, it will flow into the Pacific Ocean. But all the rain that falls on the east side will flow into the Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. And what on that Rocky Mountains, on that divide there, all the rain that falls flows those two ways. So theoretically, every drop of rain that falls east of the Rocky Mountains, flows into the Atlantic, and every drop of rain that flows west flows into the Pacific Ocean. All right, or now, that is the continental divide. It divides and separates the continent in that way. It's the high point through which everything flows the opposite from it. Well, that's what verse 34 is in this chapter. All right, if you'll kind of keep that in mind, it is this divide. And let's look at it. This is the transition in the chapter. This section here, verse 29 and following is the transition, but especially verse 32 and following, where he's setting up for transitioning into answering the second question as Jesus sees it. And he's talking about the fig tree, And when you see all these things, you know that it's near, it's at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation, now that's the controversial term. You need to note this. This generation is what is a controversial term with that. If you understand this term with its plain interpretation, then you would see Jesus talking to people that were living then, people that were of that generation. And he's saying, these things are going to happen within the lifetime of those who are living. Now, premillennialists have a real problem with this verse. And that's why they have done some fanciful interpretation to try to get around the basic, clear meaning of this verse. Premillennialists say that, all that generation has died. We're 2,000 years away from that, or 1,900 years away from that. And therefore, Christ has not come back. And they're looking for these signs to happen. They believe that all these signs are referring to his final end of time coming, or at least his coming to reign upon the earth. So they see this term, this generation, as referring to Israel, or to a race of people, to the Israel race. But that's not a good interpretation of this word. Matthew uses this phrase in Matthew 1:17, in 11:16, 12:41, 42:45, and 23:36. And this phrase in those references is used to indicate a period of 40 years or a period of the people's lifetime. All right? The Greek dictionary, Art and Gingrich, the standard lexicon for the Greek, says basically it's the sum total of those born at the same time, expanded to include those living at a given time, a generation, contemporaries. You and I are of the same generation, all right? People that lived in the 1800s, people that lived in the 1940s, we're of a different generation, all right? We are of the generation now. McClintock and Strong define this in their Greek lexicon as the generations of persons then living contemporary with Christ. So you have here a very important section in another book that we used in our first lecture to talk about the significance of eschatology. Forgot the author of that a minute. The book by Jonathan Min. He writes about this term, this generation, that every other use, a premillennialist admitted this. He's not a premillennialist, but he quotes a premillennialist that admitted, every other use of this generation in Matthew refers to Christ contemporaries. D.A. Carson, the prominent commentator, concludes that this generation can only with the greatest difficulty be made to mean anything other than the generation living when Jesus spoke. Even if generation by itself can have a slightly larger semantic range, to make generation refer to all believers in every age, or the generation of believers alive when eschatological events start to happen, is highly artificial. What we have here is a terminus ad quorum, that is the latest limiting point to this distress other than the parousia itself. That is, what we have here is a limiting of all these events that he described in verses 4 really down through verse 31 specifically, but really through 28 for sure, as these signs, these descriptions are all about the destruction of Jerusalem and are going to take place within the lifetime of the contemporaries of Jesus. All right? So, in outlining this passage, we've got, he's dealing with two questions. When is the temple going to be destroyed? And when am I going to make my final return? There's some overlap there because he is seen as pictured as coming through the agency of the Roman army and bringing judgment upon the Jews because of their rejection of him. Remember, even at the cross, he will speak about this same idea when they are weeping for him on his way to the cross. I think about, for example, I think it's in Matthew's account. He talked about him weeping. I don't see it here. I have to find that later. But anyways, Jesus is talking about here in Matthew 24. This key passage is verse 34. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Now, we've understood the question. Now let's go back and notice what things will happen to this generation. Let's look at what's going to happen to this generation. Let's read verse 4 and following. Jesus answered them and said, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed. For this must take place, but the end is not yet. The destruction of the end of these temple destruction is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of the birth pains. They will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. You will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. That's what's going to happen to the apostles. That's what happened to the Christians in the first century. Many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. Many people are going to lose their faith. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. The one who remains faithful, who endures this persecution, will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Talking about the message of Paul and the other apostles carrying the gospel out throughout the world. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now notice, some of the signs that he's suggesting here on your sheet are false messiahs would arise. There's going to be some false Christ to arise. Numerous military encounters, famines, earthquakes would occur. Disciples would be persecuted. Lawlessness will grow. Saints will depart from the faith. The gospel will be preached far and wide. Christ now turns to describing the impending invasion. He says this is what was prophesied by Daniel. Daniel's prophecy refers to the first coming of Christ and not to his second. Premillennialists want to talk about Daniel's prophecy and it applying to Christ's second coming in the 70 weeks prophecy and things. And all that is a reference to his first coming and to his death and to his resurrection. It's not a reference to his second coming, Daniel 9:24-27. If you look at a parallel account in Luke 21 records this same story, same sermon, if you will. And in verse 20-24, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. So Luke doesn't use the figurative language, this idea of the desolation that Daniel had predicted. Talking about the coming of Christ, this also has a reference to what happened before Christ came, when the Antiochus Epiphanes and some of the things that went on there. and the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel. Jesus is probably referring to that idea as well, which was very well known when the temple was desecrated, a swine was offered in the temple, and Jewish people had to rise up through the Maccabean revolt, overthrow them. That's the same idea here. And he's talking about the Roman army is going to be surrounding them. So Luke's account, Luke 21:20, says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. And then he's going to say they got to flee, and same kind of thought. At the end of that, they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentile until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So the Christians are instructed then, when they see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, when they see this abomination of desolation as spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, then it's just like what happened before when they see Jerusalem being destroyed, the temple is going to be destroyed, they see the armies coming to surround it. Don't think, Christians, that God is going to save Jerusalem. Don't think God is going to persevere and save the temple. But rather, this is the secret knowledge that Christians are given to flee, to get out, to escape and get away, so that they do not suffer the horrible fate that Jerusalem is going to suffer. Now, he tells them, verse 16, and those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on a housetop not go down to take what is in his house. Let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his clothes. This is not talking about the end of time. We'll find out later on that there's no time at the end of time. It's going to be like a thief in the night. There's no time to go get your coat, and it's not going to matter if you got your coat. This is talking about, hear me guys, this is very important. This is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 by the Roman army. Christ is telling them these signs about that. And alas for women who are pregnant, for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. There's going to be great tribulation. And he says it's going to be greater than it's ever been. I'll read you something about that in just a moment. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. God's going to have to intervene to save Israel in some ways. But for the sake of Christians, for the sake of the elect are Christians, not the Jewish people, but for the Christians. Those days are cut short. But if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ. If someone says, hey, there's Jesus out there, go out there to him. Jesus says, do not believe it. I'm not coming back at that time. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray and if possible even the elect. People are going to try to deceive you, but you're not going to miss my coming. You will know my coming. See, I've told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. The coming of the Son of Man is going to be so cataclysmic, so grand, there's no way you can miss it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Whatever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather, which is another reference. There the vultures, the eagles would gather. Rome had that symbol as well of the eagle, and another reference to that. Now, let's talk a little bit about this judgment. Verse 21. Jerusalem is going to suffer greatly. This great tribulation such has not been seen in the world before. This is a quote from R.C.H. Lenski. No nation has ever piled up guilt such as that of the Jews who were chosen of God, infinitely blessed, yet crucified God's Son and trampled upon all his further grace. No judgment had ever and can ever be so severe. In the history of the world, no judgment can be compared with this that wiped out the Jews as a nation. The destruction of Jerusalem is going to be a significant biblical and cultural event that ended the nation of Jerusalem, nation of Jews as we know it. They lost their ability to worship God in the way the Old Testament described. The temple was destroyed and was never rebuilt. They lost their genealogical records. They were destroyed physically in the slaughter of just hundreds of thousands of their lives. It was a destruction of the Jewish nation and a ruin of the Jewish nation as was known in ancestry in ancient times. Here's a quote from Alfred Edersheim, The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. The tribulation of Israel was unparalleled in the terrible past of its history, and unequaled even in its bloody future. Nay, so dreadful would be the persecution that if divine mercy had not interposed for the sake of the followers of Christ, the whole Jewish race that inhabited the land would have been swept away. It was unparalleled carnage. Wayne Jackson quotes from Josephus, who writes about this and was actually involved in betraying the Jews and became a part of the Roman army. But he writes this: the carnage of the siege, which lasted 5 months, was so horrible beyond belief. Thousands died of starvation. When the Romans finally broke into the city, the sight of so many corpses shocked even hardened soldiers. The slaughter of the city's citizens was so terrible that fires were extinguished by the profusion of blood. Josephus records, now his numbers might be a little bit inflated, but it could have been lower or higher. He records that 1,100,000 Jews were killed in Jerusalem. That some 97,000 others were taken as slaves into captivity, and it has been estimated that some 1,337,000 Jews, there were some 1,337,000 Jews in Jerusalem and the regions adjacent to Judea, died by famine, by sword, by burning, and by crucifixion. Some scholars believe that these figures are too conservative. In fact, Josephus himself expressed the view that suffering of this Holocaust exceeded anything known to man previously. It is worthy of notation that it is at least possible that Jesus' comments of verse 21 might have been restricted to the Jews suffering and not mankind as a whole, though the facts of history do not force one to that conclusion. Yet because Christians had been warned of by Christ, history does not record, listen to this, history does not record the death of a single Christian. Eusebius, the early church writer, recorded that Christians fled Jerusalem and found refuge at Pella beyond the Jordan River. You see, Christians knew because they had the insight of Christ. They understood Matthew 24 as a reference to when you see Jerusalem surrounded. Don't wait around to say, hey, is this going to be a peaceful thing? Don't wait around to see, is God going to strike them down like he did the Assyrians in the Old Testament and killed 185,000 Assyrians? Don't wait around. You get out because it's going to be a destruction like the world has never seen nor would ever see again. Now you might say, well, what about the Holocaust, or what about Stalin, or what about some of these things that happened in the 20th century? Certainly those were terrible and they involved more people. I think an answer might be by percentage, when you think about the city of Jerusalem, and if you look at that statistic that even we have there, 1.1 were killed or died, and then 1.3 were inhabited, 1.3 of the area were killed, then you realize by the population numbers that it was just really a total destruction of a high percentage of the population. And so it was a terrible thing that no one would have survived if God had not cut short those days. Temple was destroyed, and the temple was never rebuilt. Never rebuilt. It still is like it is, like it was then today. And of course, the Dome of the Rock, the sacred Islamic building, was built there on the temple site, and that causes a lot of controversy even to this day. All right, so we're down through verse 28. So Jesus is talking about the prophecies of Daniel. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Know when these things are going to take place. That's when the answer to the first question is. Now, verse 29 through 30 are difficult because they don't seem to really fit. I tell you, they're some of the harder verses for me to understand with it. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened. Now, this idea, people often want to say, oh, this is going to be the signs of when Christ comes. The sun darkened, the moon turned to blood. That kind of the idea. The moon not giving us light, stars will fall from heaven, the powers of heaven will be shaken. That's common apocalyptic literature. That's common language found in the Bible for the significant changes in political powers. All right, it's common language. For example, it's used in Isaiah. I have this on your sheet too. Back a little bit before we talked about Jerusalem suffering greatly. This is prophetic language found in Isaiah 13, 10, 11, Isaiah 19, 1, Ezekiel 32, Joel 2, Acts chapter 2. Common language for God is bringing a complete reversal, a complete change in the political system as we know it, in the world as we know it. So he's saying that Christ is doing something that was going to blow the mind of these apostles. That it's going to be a tremendous change. And I think that's the idea here. That this tribulation is totally ushering in a new age, a new time. And it certainly did with Rome destroying Jerusalem. And then all that will lead in subsequent years of history. And of course that's going to bring in greater persecution to the Christians. One thing that Jonathan Min pointed out, is that really this destruction of Jerusalem is going to be the separation between Christianity and Judaism in the eyes of the Roman Empire. It led to the formal separation of Judaism and Christianity. Romans were prone to identify Christianity as a sect of Judaism, intimately and necessarily bound up with it. But after the destruction of Jerusalem, the Christians' failure to support the revolt and their escape from Jerusalem were regarded by their Jewish fellow countrymen as an apostasy. As a result, after AD 70, the Jewish leaders attacked Jewish Christians in their presence in the synagogue and their status as Jews. And so Jewish Christians were no longer perceived by the Roman government as under the umbrella of Judaism, and therefore faced the cruel dilemma of either forsaking Christ or worshiping Caesar. And so it separated Judaism from Christianity in the eyes of the world and in the eyes of Judaism, and it totally made it a separate religion or faith as Christ intended, which is then going to lead in the years of 70, 80, decades of 70, 80, 90 AD, the Roman government then turning and being upset and blaming Christians for a lot of its problems. And you're going to see empire-wide persecution beginning in about the 90s. And that's going to be, I think, what the book of Revelation is addressing, when the Roman Empire then is attacking Christians. All right, so that's what he's talking about here. It's going to be a tremendous change. Then will appear in the heavens. And this could be a foreshadowing. This could be this idea that it is kind of a view before, recapitulation, the theologians call it, where he's referring to his second coming before, and maybe coming in the idea of his judgment coming in on Jerusalem. Kind of like I was talking about before, with Jesus often is pictured as coming in judgment within time upon a nation. And I think maybe that's what we have here. This will appear in heaven, the sign of the Son of Man. All the tribes of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So there's going to be an exaltation, apocalyptic language here. Maybe an exaltation of Christ. They realize the Jewish system has been put down, and Christ now is going to be exalted, and we're going to see the Christian age really take off. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet and call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Possibly a reference to the final end of time, but giving that all these things are going to take place during this generation, our continental divide of verse 34, we see then that this is possibly talking about the idea that all of God's people, they fled out away from Jerusalem to get away, but Christ is still going to be caring for them, and they're still going to have his messengers, his spirits with them, and He's going to unite them together in His church. All right, so verse 32, from the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branches becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you read the signs of the fig tree. So also when you see all these things, when you see these things taking place, when you see all these signs that He's given us from verse 4 through verse 28, when you see these things take place, you know that it's near. Notice that they are at the very gates. When you see the Roman army at the very gates, you get out, you flee, don't mess around. Remember, Jesus is talking only about 40 years before these events will take place. Truly I say to you, verily, certainly I say to you, verse 34, this generation will not pass away till these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. It's an expression for, at one time, everything's going to change, but His words are going to be true. You can depend on what I'm saying. All right, so that gets us down to verse 36. All right, so we've answered the first question from verse 34 forward. When will the temple be destroyed? And the answer is in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. That's when those things are going to take place. The Jewish nation will be destroyed, and Christians are encouraged to flee, get out, don't stay around, because that's going to be a terrible tribulation. This is not a reference to some futuristic tribulation that's going to happen before Christ returns to set up His kingdom on the earth. No, this has already taken place. It took place during that generation, during that time period. All right, now we turn to answering the second question. Verse 36. Now notice the change. We've had that transition. Those things are going to take place during that generation. You can depend upon it. Now notice the word but. But there's a change. Concerning that day, notice how before we'd been talking about days. We'd been talking about false Christ and these different things that you need to look for, and earthquakes and wars and all this kind of stuff going on within days. And you need to flee during days, unless those days are shortened. But He says now, notice the transition. But of that, and then you have the modifying word there, that day. Signifying that we're talking about one day. And even hour, of that day and hour, no one knows. Remember, it's similar to John chapter 5, when He talks about that there's coming an hour, a time, when all who are in the grave will hear His voice and come forth. That's John chapter 5, 25 and following. The specific reference is verse 28. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear His voice. See, there's coming a specific point in history. Specific point in history. But of that day and hour, no one knows. Now, this is totally different than the first discussion. The first discussion is, know these signs, like reading a fig leaf, a fig tree. You know these signs so that you know when it's going to happen. When you see the Roman army surrounding Jerusalem, when you see all these things, this is when it's going to happen. But now He says, answering the second question, when will be the end of the age? When will I come back? Of that day and of that hour, no one knows. You see the difference? A tremendously different change in tone and discussion and meaning. Not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. I don't even know, He says, when that day is going to come. Now, He knows when all these other days are going to be. He knows when the temple is going to be destroyed. He does not know when He's going to return. So we have a point in history of where we know Christ is not going to come back before. We know Christ was not going to come back before AD 70 in the destruction of Jerusalem, because He said that. He said, I want you to know it's going to be, all these signs are going to take place. Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. The nation's going to be destroyed. It's going to be terrible days. But after that point in history, no one knows. And there's not any signs given when He's going to come back. But the Father only. Verse 37, for were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, and notice, life is going to be going on normally. life going on normally. When Noah entered the ark and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. It's going to be like that. It's going to be sudden. Then 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken. This is not a reference to some secret snatching or rapturing away that has been invented later on, but this is a reference to the suddenness and to the calling up of those who are his children first. 1 Thessalonians 4. 2 men will be taken. One will be taken, one left. 2 women grinding at the mill. One will be taken and one left. It's going to be a sudden thing. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know what day your Lord is coming. You don't know. There's no signs. There's no warnings. You're not going to figure it out. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour you do not expect. This is consistent with what we studied in a couple lectures ago about all that Jesus said about the second coming. It's consistent with what we said in the first lecture today about the parables of Jesus and about how the emphasis on the parables of Jesus is this suddenness, this watching, this preparation that we must be in because we do not know when Christ is going to return. He's coming in an hour we do not expect. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household to give them the food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant, whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants, and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and an hour he does not know. And he will cut him in pieces and put him in with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. We read that phrase before, haven't we? So, we need to finish up. So we've seen verse 34 is our continental divide, separating these two thoughts, these answers to these two questions. When am I going to return? That's the answer to the second question. The first question is, when are these signs going to be of the destruction of the temple? When is the temple going to be destroyed in these things? He answers that one by giving a bunch of signs, telling them it's when those things spoken about Daniel is going to be fulfilled. It's got to do with Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. We know that happened historically from the destruction of Jerusalem, which is a key biblical event that the New Testament refers to and speaks of. And history is shaped by when Rome destroys Jerusalem in AD 70. And then we know the change after verse 34, it changes. There's a tone from days to one day, from false Christ and us, all this life going on like normal, to life's going to be going on like normal, and then he's going to come suddenly, and it's going to be the end. He's coming in an hour we do not expect him. And then if you continue to read the context, remember they didn't have chapters originally. If you go right through chapter 25, you read what we just studied in the last class, the parable of the 10 virgins. What's that about? He's coming at a time you don't expect. The parable of the talents, got that underlying message. You got to be responsible for using your gifts and your talents because he's coming in an hour that you're going to have to give an account when you don't know when he's coming back. And then final judgment described in 31 through 46. He's coming at a time, once again, we don't know, and we're going to be judged based upon how we have served and cared for others like him on that judgment. And then you'll go away into eternal life or eternal punishment. Not a 1,000-year reign on earth, but that's going to bring the end at judgment, and that will be the end, and we'll go to either eternal life or eternal punishment. All right, guys, I hope that you have understood better chapter 24. Undoubtedly, there's some difficult parts, but I think great strides can be made if we view verse 34 as a dividing point. And if we see the first part is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and the second part is talking about the final end of time, and we see the apostles, let me state that again, if we see Jesus as answering two questions, when will these things be, when will the temple be destroyed, and when will I come back? All right, let's close with a prayer. Father, we're thankful for this day and thankful for this time we've had to be together. Father, I know there's a lot of misunderstanding about Matthew 24. I pray that you'll give us humility as we try to interpret it. Help us to not allow it to contradict other passages that are straightforward and clear. And help us to better understand what you meant for us to understand from it. and to realize how this interpretation fits in with history. And we pray that you'll bless us as we, most importantly, realize know when you're going to return, but we're instructed to be patient, to wait in hope, and to wait in faith.